Matt Segall. Matt Segall received his doctoral degree in 2016 from the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at CIIS, and he now teaches there. He teaches German Idealism and process philosophy, and he also published this fantastic book, Physics of the World Soul, Whitehead's Adventure in Cosmology. And he blogs regularly at footnotes2plato.com, the number 2, and his YouTube channel goes by the same name, Footnotes to Plato. Was it Whitehead who had the Footnotes to Plato quote, Matt?
That's correct. It's great to be here with you, by the way, Matthew.
Yeah,
And
welcome. Thank you so much.
yeah, Whitehead in first few pages of Process and Reality says that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Yeah. So I definitely lifted that
Yeah.
from Whitehead for my
Yeah,
blog.
that's awesome. Well, as I mentioned to you pre-recording, I've listened to a lot of conversations that you've had, and I've enjoyed doing that. And I feel like out of anyone that I've read who talks about Whitehead, you kind of articulate his ideas more clearly, at least for me, than others. And so I really appreciate that. And I want to ask you questions and a little bit about Whitehead. But before that, usually I ask guests about, their upbringing a little bit and how religious or non-religious their upbringings were. I wanted to maybe kind of skip through some of that a little bit because I have heard you talk about that, and I wanted to kind of just go over a few things that I've heard you say and maybe get you to react to those things. But as far as I can tell, early on, you had a period where you were kind of fixated on your mother's mortality, and by extension, I guess your own mortality. And that seemed to maybe plant a seed for your pull toward philosophy. Is that right?
Yeah, you've done your homework. Yeah, so I do usually tell the story when I'm asked, what first got me into philosophy, by sharing that as a 6 or 7 year old, I was in first grade. I realized at home one day, like over the weekend or something, uh, when my mom was on the phone with a friend of hers, I was just bouncing up and down on the bed, and all of a sudden it hit me that she was gonna die one day, and it kind of turned my whole world upside down. And for weeks, I would not be able to finish a day at school because I would just be worried that she wouldn't be there when I got home. And so it only shifted for me. I shifted out of that state of panic and anxiety, which was a new feeling for a 7 year old,
Yeah.
when I realized that I too was going to die. And, for reasons I've been reflecting on ever since, that fact was quite different than the death of someone I loved. My own death seemed far more mysterious and less tragic. And I realized that all of us, gradually, this wasn't going through my mind as a 7 year old, but over the years, in contemplating the mystery of my own death, came to see, we all share, every human being shares this sense of being in relationship to something beyond themselves through the portal of death. And none of us knows what's on the other side. We have lots of ideas. We inherit some. We maybe come up with some on our own. Maybe we have some experiences while we're alive that give us hints, but none of us
Hmm.
knows.
Yeah.
And as Plato, and Socrates, given voice by Plato, is so good at reminding us, philosophy itself is learning to die, and perhaps finding ways to practice death while still alive.
Mm.
And so, in that way, to discover, what it is to be a soul um, in the midst of embodied life, and to put that embodied life into a greater context. Um, that's what the contemplation of death is all about. So yeah, that's definitely, looking back, where it all started for me.
Yeah. Well, can you say just a little bit more about your um what does it mean to you that that philosophy is kind of the practice of dying while you're still alive?
Well, in the Platonic tradition, it's often nowadays, it could be attacked often because we're in a kind of materialistic age for being more dualistic, in the sense that
Yeah.
it thinks that there's a soul above, not only separate from, but kind of above the body. And there's this sort of two world caricature, I would say, of Platonism.
Yeah.
And maybe Platonism is that way, but as I often will put it, Plato wrote dialogues, not doctrines, and
Mm.
all the best refutations of his ideas are also in his dialogues. So
True.
um, when we think about philosophy, though, it does for Plato have something to do um, with the soul, with awakening to the life of the soul and the spirit, you could say. And we can start to I mean, Plato says that the soul has three parts, really, that the human being is made of three parts, and that the spirit is this higher part that's rational, that's trying to get a handle on our instincts and our will, and our feeling life. And I think in saying that philosophy is learning to die, what it's really about is coming to deepen our acquaintance with that aspect of ourselves that maybe doesn't die,
Mm.
or that is yeah, in some way eternal.
Yes.
And how do we participate in that eternal realm via the soul and the spirit while we are embodied? Um, because we can't really see yet what happens after we die. But for Plato, we can contact this other realm, and it's not necessarily separate from this realm. So I don't want to get pigeonholed into a kind of dualism here,
Yeah.
but we're not naturally aware of these soul and spirit realities just by virtue of being enculturated as a human being. So we have to
Yeah.
cultivate that.
Whew. Man, I could ask so many questions about that, but I want to make sure to get to some that I had prepared.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, another thing that has stood out to me from the conversations I've listened to with you as far as earlier in your life, you were fortunate enough in high school to take a philosophy class, which seems pretty unique and awesome. And not only that, but as if I remember correctly, your teacher brought in Alan Watts into the class.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
super cool because Alan Watts doesn't usually get brought into the classroom much, as far as I can tell. And so I feel like you were lucky to be introduced to philosophy in the classroom in high school, and also to Alan Watts. And so it sounds like three of your early influences were Alan Watts, Carl Jung, and Terence McKenna.
Mm-hmm.
And those were three of my early influences as well. I think I probably found Carl Jung before the other two, and then Alan Watts, and then Terence McKenna. But um, your consumption of Terence McKenna videos, right? Which there are so many out there. Thank goodness, it's
Mm-hmm.
amazing. But it seems like he catalyzed your interest in Whitehead actually too, but that took later for you to really start wrestling with Whitehead and reading him.
Hmm.
But also planted the seed for an interest in psychedelics as well. And I heard you reference an early psychedelic experience where you had some sort of vision of Jesus.
Yeah.
And if you're comfortable doing so, I really would like to hear a little bit more about that experience.
Hmm. Yeah, sure. Um, these things are difficult to talk about, but uh, plenty has been written on the way that psychedelics, in this case, it was psilocybin mushrooms, can catalyze mystical and visionary states of consciousness. And for me at the time, I was 19. It was the first time I ate mushrooms. Took about 5 grams, following Terrence's instructions, and was just alone in my room in the evening. And I had read a lot of Terrence's work. At the time, I considered myself um, a practicing Buddhist. I was at least attempting meditation of various types, and mostly Zen. And I, just to provide more context, had really not only drifted away from, but reacted against kind of Christian worldview, which I had inherited mostly from my mother. And um, my mom's Jewish, my mom's Christian, and my dad is Jewish, and so I have that biblical background there, which was never really forced on me, but just enough. It was present just enough and encouraged just enough that I looked into it and was like, oh no, I can't do that. So,
Mm.
anyways, definitely was not looking for an experience of Jesus, and
Yeah.
was not expecting that to show up. But sure enough, about an hour into this mushroom experience, I'm writing in my journal, and all of a sudden, what I can only describe as the logos, but a really personalized logos, like the logos become flesh. It felt human, and it indeed introduced itself as Jesus. Though I don't know what else I can say about it other than it felt like a dialogue with the ground of being. And in anyone who's done high dose psilocybin or any of the proper psychedelics will hopefully have some
Hmm.
sense what that means. And but it was a shock to me, and definitely shifted my outlook spiritually, and allowed me to return to the biblical tradition, and to look at more of the mystical and esoteric interpretations of that tradition, which indeed is what I've had always been exposed to when I looked to Asia for spiritual insight. I wasn't getting the mainstream, Theravada stuff. It was more like what the elite spiritual teachers were. And so there's also elite spiritual teachings in the Western tradition, and I just hadn't
Absolutely.
been exposed to that yet. And so this experience, this encounter, was profoundly important for bringing me back home, as it were. And I had already read Jung telling me, warning against looking to the exotic Eastern traditions for psychological and spiritual development, because those traditions aren't really made for me, as
Mm.
someone who grew up, in the United States. So
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Um, so that experience kind of it brought you back home, so to speak, as you said. And so since that experience, you have kind of, I know I've heard you say that you kind of consider yourself some sort of Christian, maybe. Is that right?
yeah, I think A Christian hermeticist might be the closest thing.
Yeah,
But I wouldn't offer. I don't go around identifying
sure.
unless I'm asked, and there's lots of explanation required typically to make sense of what it would mean to call myself that. But yeah,
Yeah, I understand that. I understand that. Yeah, for sure. Um, so before we move on to other things, aside from that psychedelic experience, have you had any kind of non-ordinary experiences that were not um catalyzed by psychedelics that kind of had a deep impact or maybe caused a paradigm shift for you?
yeah. Um, I mean, the most powerful non-drug induced experience I had
Hmm.
was in Israel, visiting the Yad Vashem Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem, and or in the hills above Jerusalem. And uh, long story short, I won't go into all the details, but there's a children's memorial in the gardens, and you sort of go downstairs, and it's dark. You're underground, and there's like a few candles lit with mirrors that are reflecting the candles into the distance, seemingly infinitely. And over the speakers, there's just a woman's voice reading the names of the however many millions of children were killed during the Holocaust, and there's some like choral music, and just walking through this exhibit, this memorial, you know, really pushed me into a meditation, kind of urgent searching inquiry into the nature of evil, and I I think it's important to I said this was non-drug induced, and I guess technically I was 19 at the time, and in Israel the drinking age is 18. So the night before, I had a little bit too much vodka, and I was pretty hungover
Yeah.
the next day going into this memorial. So there's that. And I was in a more sensitive emotional place because of that, I guess. But
Yeah.
so I was just there walking through this dark tunnel and hearing these children's names, and searching for the source of the evil that could have done this, and just sort of had this out of body experience, um, merging with Nazi soldiers. Like I was really trying to bring myself back to um, that time to understand like why, how could this happen, and was, yes, like shamanically merging with Nazi soldiers who were in the midst of committing these heinous crimes, and like searching for the evil and not finding it there, and realizing that these people are these are just kids too, who are confused, following orders, not sure, is this right? What, but how can I resist? So I didn't find the evil anywhere I looked, and
Mm.
that was disorienting. And so
Yeah.
then I walk out the other side of this exhibit in this altered state, crying and embarrassed about the fact that I'm crying, and unable to look anyone in the face, because I saw how unique, infinitely unique each person was. And in the context of the millions who were killed, the crime of killing a human being, I mean, taking life in general, it's, you know, morally suspect, but a human being in particular, no two are alike, right? And
Mhm.
the uniqueness of each person in looking at them in the face was just too much for me to handle. And so I just look down at the grass, and then see every blade of grass is just as infinitely unique as the human faces I was unable to look at.
Yeah.
And there I was standing on top of it. And so it just, hit me how, yeah, infinitely precious this world is, and all of its facets. And I didn't get an answer to my, query about the origins of evil, except perhaps just that in order to make room for such infinite individuality and the value that comes from that, evil is somehow a side effect of that effulgence of creativity, I guess. I mean, that's kind of intellectualizing it, but
Oof, man, I'm glad I asked that question. Thank you for sharing that. That hit me in
yeah.
the heart.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I think that story, that experience that you had, it just it reminds me of how, in certain spiritual orientations that really emphasize like oneness, that type of infinite diversity or individuality can often get de-emphasized or almost seen as unimportant or something. And think that I think we probably share um, a spiritual approach that doesn't want to de-emphasize that. You know what I mean? That for me, I it's clear that everything is interdependently connected. That's clear to me, and so in that way, there is a oneness. But I think it's equally important, or maybe even more. I don't know. Can't really put a hierarchy on it, but it's equally important to realize that although everything is interdependently connected into one network or whatever, that each individual thing is, as you said, I mean, like extremely unique. And so I think that it seems like Whitehead speaks to that as well. And maybe that's part of the reason. I don't know how long ago was that you had the experience that you just talked about.
It was not long after my first, no, it was actually just before my first mushroom experience. So I was
Oh,
about
okay.
19 also at the same, it was 19. Yeah.
Do you think that that primed you for being more kind of for resonating with Whitehead even more when you finally kind of came around to him?
Yeah, probably. I mean, I haven't, ever made that connection myself, but Whitehead described his philosophy as a kind of pluralistic realism. He did definitely wanted to do justice to individuality, not just human individuals, but individuality as as a mode of creativity, and that yes, of course, there's a unity in things and a wholeness,
Yeah.
but for Whitehead, the wholeness of things is always passing beyond itself. It's always
Right.
growing, right? And so in growing, it's perpetually incomplete, and it's incomplete precisely because of the creative contributions of each individual from moment to moment. And so, yeah, the contributions get woven into this, infinitely nested series of relationships, but the whole is incomplete, right?
Yeah.
It's moving beyond itself because of the role individuality plays. Yeah. So I think
Fantastic.
they're definitely, that spiritual experience primed me to appreciate what Whitehead was trying to protect in his metaphysics for sure.
Trying to protect. I like that.
Yeah.
Um, so before we go deeper into Whitehead, because like as I said, I really like the way that you explain his ideas, and so while I have you here, I want to kind of pick your brain a little bit on that. But before that, another figure that you've made me especially interested in the last few weeks, especially is Goethe.
Hmm.
So I've really never read much of his work, to be honest. But I've heard him referenced for years and years, and I've in my head I always there's a light shining on him. I know he's important, and but the way that you have described his like alternative scientific method.
Mm.
That's what I'm most interested in. And so can you say a little bit about like his alternative scientific method?
Yeah, sure. You know, Goethe is often known more for his poetry and his literature, and people who know a little bit more will know the role he played in the court of Weimar as a sort of statesman, state bureaucrat, really. And very few, though, know about his scientific work, with which Goethe himself considered to be really his most important contribution. Um, he developed a theory of plant morphology. Um, he developed really the science of morphology itself as applied to um, the skeletons of different animal species, and pioneered the development of that science. And was also very interested in color, the experience of color. He wrote a theory of colors, entering into a polemic with Newton and the Newtonians, for whom color was explained by reduction to the diverse refrangibility of prisms and the geometry involved. And so Goethe felt like that did violence to the phenomena themselves, which he tried to bring back into our understanding, our scientific understanding of color. And so, really, for Goethe, he was worried about the direction that natural science was going in his day, because it was becoming more and more abstract and more removed from human experience and even opposed to human experience. More and more science was coming to explain away human experience by reduction to some mechanism, which was resolved mathematically and that couldn't be perceived with the senses at all. And so for Goethe, this was a function of, in part, our the instrumentation that scientists were using. Microscopes, telescopes, other instruments were becoming more and more refined already, around 1800 when Goethe was doing this work. And he felt like it was throwing our understanding of nature out of proportion, because our mind is evolved to attune to our particular sensory organs and their organization, eyes, ears, and so on. And for Goethe, the human being, he says this literally: the human being is the most refined and precise instrument that we have for studying nature,
Oof.
right?
Yeah.
And when we use microscopes and telescopes, which he wasn't trying to forbid that. He was just saying, be careful about the way that those instruments throw your senses out of whack, because we didn't evolve to think about the magnitudes, whether super small or super big, that these scientific instruments and the numerical measures that we come up with to make sense of what those instruments are revealing. Our imaginations, we can't just make the world we're used to bigger or smaller. Like, nature behaves very differently at these different scales, but
Yeah.
we're apt to project our understanding of this middle level world onto those domains. And so you end up thinking of the quantum. I mean, nowadays Goethe didn't have quantum physics, but his concern has just become magnified tremendously nowadays, with techno-industrial approaches to science dominating everything. And there's a model centrism that's so much worse than what Goethe was already complaining about,
Yeah.
with the Newtonian understanding of color. And so he was trying to cultivate a more participatory form of science that brought the human mind and human knowing back into touch with the natural world that we're attempting to know.
Yeah.
And so he was protesting against abstraction in natural science, and in many ways, that's exactly what Whitehead was doing. Though Whitehead has more mathematical and scientific training than Goethe did. Goethe was self-taught in science, and so is a bit more Goethe's work in science is a bit more idiosyncratic. I mean, he's a genius, no doubt, but it wasn't his studies into these various natural phenomena didn't catch the attention of scientists and didn't
Hmm.
affect scientific practice because they weren't written in a way that scientists could work with or even
Yeah.
understand. So
Mhm.
unfortunately, the Goethean method remains kind of niche nowadays, though it's still very much alive and practiced. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah, it seems I was thinking of that phrase, I might have it wrong, from Whitehead, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Is that right?
Yep.
Yeah, that seems to relate to what you were saying about Goethe. Like,
Mm-hmm.
and I totally am drawn toward thinkers that put the emphasis on the direct experience rather than on the abstraction, and I guess on the actual occasion in Whitehead's terms.
Mm-hmm.
And so, let's jump into a little bit more Whitehead stuff. I know that he basically he created a lot of his own language to try to describe his ideas because of all the baggage that other conventional terms had. And, he wanted to avoid that, which is totally understandable. And it's fascinating, his own, linguistic matrix that he creates. But I think a lot of people have understandably so, have a hard time reading him for that reason and others. But two of his ideas that are the most interesting to me that I would love to hear you talk about. Can you say anything about the relationship between concrescence and prehension?
Mm. Yeah.
Those two things stand out to me, and I would love to hear like how they relate with each other.
Yeah. I mean, those are the two most important conceptual innovations that Whitehead offers us. And I mean, to fully unpack, I mean, I'd
Yeah,
have to,
I know it's a lot, but maybe just kind of your own,
yeah.
what comes to mind first for you.
So Whitehead's describing all of reality, or what we might better describe as the process of realization, in terms of concrescence. And concrescence for him means the growing together of the many into a novel unity of emergent value. And so concrescence is Whitehead's solution to the ancient problem of the one and the many. It's his way of showing how they each require one another. Our concept of the one makes no sense without an attendant concept of the many, and that paradoxically, the two require each other. But even to say that there are two is already to privilege a kind of pluralism. So Whitehead is biased in the direction of plurality. He's an empiricist, and so concrescence for Whitehead is ultimately descriptive and not explanatory, which is a point that came out in my dialogue with Bernardo Kastrup, actually.
Yeah.
Concrescence is, and any of Whitehead's concepts are not meant to explain the world. They're meant to describe it. And in describing it, to help us effectively engage with that experience. In some ways, what he's hoping is for his terminology to elucidate our experience, right? To shed light on what might still be inchoate or implicit in our experience and not yet brought to the level of understanding. So concrescence, it's the growing together of the many into the one. Concrescence is also his account of time and causality, and here's where prehension comes in. The many that are brought into unity in the process of concrescence are prehensions. And prehensions are aspects of the surrounding environment, which is also the past, right? Whitehead's relativistic in the sense that for him space and time are entwined. They're separable in another important way, but I'll get to that. But so prehension refers to how the many perished subjects or superjects in the environing past are taken up into a new moment of present experience. So concrescence is like it's the portal, it's the passageway by means of which the past enters again into the present. And the present for Whitehead is always subjectively experienced, right? And so for Whitehead, what a subjective experience is, it's not any longer like what Descartes had imagined, that there's a abiding subject that's already there and then it has experiences of a world separate from itself. No, for Whitehead, the subject grows out of or concresces out of the world of environing objects. And those objects are themselves perished subjects, right? So concrescence is the growing together of those perished subjects or objects into a new present moment of experience, which then adds some novel value to the world in the form of a unique perspective and a value which has never been achieved before. And as soon as that satisfaction occurs, as soon as that moment of experience completes its concrescence, it perishes. And it becomes a superject, which is a gift of the value achieved to the next generation of concressing occasions of experience. And so prehension in this process is how actual occasions objectify one another. And in Whitehead's terms, to objectify something is to turn what was merely a potential into a component of something actual, right? So each of us inherits our past. We have no choice but to inherit our past, but we do have a choice as to how we inherit it, right? And so if we didn't objectify the past, if we just inherited it as it is, nothing could ever change. We just keep repeating, right? And so we objectify. This is why Whitehead would say the point is not to avoid abstraction; it's to notice when you're doing it. We can't avoid abstraction.
Right.
Experience as such is the process of abstraction, and prehension is the process by which we abstract. Prehension is the feeling of an aspect of the environment, not the whole environment. We prehend aspects of the environment under conditions, and we, in each moment, in each concrescence, we have some agency over how we inherit that past, right? And you didn't ask me about this other neologism,
Please
but
go ahead.
in ingression, in some sense, is the polar complement to prehension. Although prehension is the more general category, because ingression is a form of prehension. Sorry if that confuses things, but ingression is how Whitehead describes the way that novel possibilities enter into a concressing occasion to characterize how the past is being inherited, and then characterizing how we're able to change and not just repeat the past. And so ingression is where the novelty comes from that allows for change. Ingression you could also refer to as, rather than a physical prehension of the environing past, it's a conceptual prehension of an as yet unrealized possibility. Whitehead calls those unrealized possibilities eternal objects.
Right.
So, that's kind of some of the conceptual apparatus there.
Yeah, it's fascinating and it makes a lot of sense. It's also still still slightly ambiguous to me. Especially kind of maybe the difference between ingression and prehension.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah, so prehension, you're saying, is kind of the process of abstraction that does allow for novelty, right?
Yeah, prehension. So Whitehead describes prehension as it has a vector quality, right? So it's how what's over there becomes here.
Right.
It's how the past flows into the present.
Right.
He he describes prehension as feeling. I mean, a synonym for
Right.
prehension would be feeling.
Right.
And it is the way in which the world beyond us enters into ourselves, right? And so, in some ways, the present moment, Whitehead says, is the influx of others into our own subjective experience. So we're
Yeah.
made of one another in
Right.
Whitehead's theme, but we're
Right.
made of one another in a way that allows for individuality, in the sense that there's a in feeling one another, in prehending one another, a kind of interval is opened up, whereby novelty can be ingressed. If there were no interval, if prehension was simply the full concrete inheritance of exactly what happened in the past into the
Yeah.
present, there would be no change,
Right.
right? And so for Whitehead, process is he calls it epical, he also calls it atomic. It comes in these concrescent unities of emergent value, right? Which each are concrete individuals that are different from what they're inheriting from the past, even though they're clearly the offspring of, and in many ways conditioned by that past. So, he's trying to find ways of describing the way in which there's both inheritance or habit as
Right.
well as novelty
Right.
or creativity. And so that's why he has to invent these terms so that he can try to make what is clearly a nebulous into something more intellectually digestible.
Yeah. I love it. I mean, I really do love it. And I think that it really does seem like an accurate description of reality to me. Um, I guess I still just kind of get tangled up in some of the language, but um, and what you were saying relates to that famous line that he has of the many become one and are increased by one, right? I love that. And so, I'm sure some of those ideas are going to leak into some of what we're about to talk about too, because the whole prehension and concrescence that stands out to me, as well as um, I think his quote, the teleology of the universe is directed to the production of beauty. I'm really struck by that. And I've heard you talk about this a little bit, but he seems to kind of have a unique vision of what beauty is. And so how did he, you know, for him to say that if there is any teleology, it's this tendency toward the production of beauty. How did he define beauty? What did he mean by beauty?
Uh, well, I'll answer in the most literal sense, which is almost word for word. I think his definition of beauty is something
Okay.
like maximal diversity held in unity.
Yes.
And to say a bit more about his innovations as regards aesthetics, if we compare Whitehead to, say, Kant, who, famously differentiates, and Kant was building on Burke, the differentiation being between beauty and the sublime, where beauty is thought to be more of a finite, finished form that we can, if we, even though for Kant you couldn't conceptually determine beauty, you could at least recognize it and judge it because it has this formal quality to it. Whereas the sublime for Kant was infinite and
Yep.
couldn't be even properly perceived, much less conceptualized. And for Whitehead, I think the difference between the two collapses a bit because Whitehead is thinking of beauty as again, unlike Kant, not never final, never finished. It is what's aimed for, and when it is perceived, Whitehead certainly thought we could perceive beauty, uh, but we're perceiving also the infinite in Whitehead's view, because for Whitehead, the experience of the present moment, he argues, intrinsically references something beyond itself. That there's something significant, or there's something signifying the beyond or the infinite
Yeah.
that is intrinsic to our experience of the present moment, right? And so it's all sublime if we pay attention, would be Whitehead's point. And it's precisely in paying attention to the sublimity of our experience that we become more capable of realizing, manifesting, producing beauty, and more sensitive to its existence, already in the environments that we inhabit. So Whitehead is kind of canceling the distinction in many ways that exists in prior understandings of, beauty versus the sublime and so on. But for him, aesthetic realization becomes the very basis of ontology, so that reality itself is in the business of composing beauty, of the process of realization is about aesthetic achievement for Whitehead. The reason we have hydrogen and helium atoms and all the way up the periodic table is because each of those atoms, of those atomic elements, is a harmonious vibratory pattern that realizes a form of beauty which is self-justifying. And because it is self-justifying, those atoms exist for billions, hundreds of billions of years, repeating that pattern of vibration, right? When we ask why does that occur, physics can tell us all about how it occurs.
Right.
I mean, the standard model is pretty good. It doesn't tell us everything, but it tells us how these vibrations all fit together and the supersymmetries and all of this, but it doesn't tell us why. And so Whitehead, in saying that the universe is in the business of producing beauty, is an answer to why, right? Because it is enjoyable to take these forms. That's
Yeah.
why. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm curious how, if we take that and apply it to like human life, and I've heard you talk about how, you know, you don't want to ever divorce philosophy or spirituality from things like ethics and, living in the world, and like I agree with that. And so I'm curious, with the things we've talked about with the production of beauty and concrescence and prehension, um how can we, living in the world today, kind of use those ideas to, you know grow as individuals, and grow together, and um find ways to create more healthy and effective relationships and communities and systems.
I mean, that's the question.
Yeah.
So what's coming up for me is this is, I think, especially relevant to Americans, is that we have a certain shallow conception of the individual. And, given everything we've said earlier about how Whitehead wants to celebrate and protect individuality from, I mean, he was really worried about various forms of absolute idealism that were prominent just as he was coming into philosophy, though they very quickly fell from that prominence as a result of the rise of logical positivism and analytic philosophy and so on, which really replaced British idealism. But Whitehead was also worried about the holism of the idealists, which erased the value of individuality, he felt. But the problem for us as modern day Americans is that we have a very shallow conception of individuality. And I think what a process oriented spiritual perspective might bring to into this conversation is to deepen our sense of what it means to be an individual by putting the individual back into the context of community, because it's always, for Whitehead, individuality is always in relationship. We find ourselves in a buzzing world amidst a democracy of fellow creatures, right? So yes, individuality, but always, always in community. And what that means, one of the ways of understanding what Whitehead means when he says that the process of reality is a concrescent one. It comes in drops of experience and units of emergent value, is to think about our own stream of consciousness. And we often, when we think back on our lives, imagine some kind of continuous stream, bringing us back to our earliest childhood memories. But we easily forget that actually every night we go to sleep and there's a break in our consciousness. And we wake up the next morning and that we're back online. But our lives are punctuated by this day-night cycle, this waking, dreaming, sleeping cycle, right?
Yeah.
Every day is a concrescence. And if we then consider this pattern of waking up and going to sleep, we zoom out, think of the whole seasonal cycle, of the earth that we're all subject to, and it has a profound effect on our moods and so on. And then you think about your whole life and the analogy one can easily make between waking and sleeping each day and birth and death itself. You start to wonder about things like reincarnation. And all of a sudden, your sense of being an individual is embedded in this larger context of a community of temporal relations, right, that stretch back to the very origins of the universe. And in that context, who are you and what is your purpose here? If you really feel into your memory, you can go through autobiographically, and for many people, most people, that's the extent of it, But if you're a little bit more curious, you might think about how the human being is itself in this phylogenetic relationship with the rest of life on Earth, and that there's been roughly 4 billion years of evolution on this planet. And if you're really nuts, you'll think about the evolution of the physical universe and what it took for heavier elements to be born in dying stars and all of this. And you start to feel not that your individuality has disappeared, but that it depends upon all the rest of this activity and all of these achievements in the past of organization and complexity that make your human life here now today possible. And so when you start to take all of that in and then ask, what am I to do? Each of us has to answer it for themselves, but I feel like putting yourself in this context gives you the means by which to provide a good answer to that question.
Yeah.
And we have so many complicated problems to solve on this planet, but ultimately we're never going to be able to begin trying to solve them until we have the will to do so. And the question of the will to do so is a profoundly spiritual one. And we, as a species, haven't yet found and not just the courage, but we haven't yet created the conditions to afford people to, courageously take on the task of living in such a way that takes seriously what we know
Mm-hmm.
about where we came from and what we are.
Yeah.
So that's not a concrete list of solutions, but it's
I
hopefully
like
a
that.
start. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the awareness of the all of the macro contexts that lead
Mm-hmm.
us to find ourselves here and now, as well as I like your emphasis on the courage as well. And, some mixture between that courage and the awareness of a bigger context seems like a good foundation, at least.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I love that. I agree with that. Well, I have one last question, but I do want to just say how much I appreciate you taking this time to speak with me. We could talk for a lot longer, and maybe some time in the future we could do a part two if you'd be down.
Mm-hmm.
So as the last question, I'm still in the same way that I'm still kind of tangled up in some of Whitehead's concepts that we've already mentioned. Another thing that I'm still trying to get hold of is kind of his conception of God, and so with the whole production of beauty, that's maybe his vision of how things unfold into the future, and then looking back at his notion of creativity and God kind of at the beginning, is that's looking backward. And so as far as I can tell from the way you've described it, um, from your book and the conversations I've listened to, it seems like creativity is kind of the the most fundamental aspect of reality to him, and God is, what is this quote? It's a cool quote. Did I write it down? Yeah, creativity's primordial superject. That's crazy. So can you say anything about that? I'm still trying to get a sense of his vision of God. So, I know that you've said like creativity for him is somewhat equated to kind of pure chaos in a certain way, right? And so God would be kind of the first filter or something, or first act of actualizing pure potential, or actualizing wild chaos into cosmos or whatever, right?
Yeah.
um is that true?
It's I found it to be an essential kind of pedagogical tool to explain these ideas, but it's not exactly right to say that creativity is just chaos and God orders it. But because the whole point is that God is a creature of creativity, so creativity is self conditioning. And if we wanted to just describe the relationship between God and creativity, we would say, yeah, creativity is like chaos, and God brings the the God provides a order which arranges possibility into a hierarchy of values, and that hierarchy of values, that vision of the ideal, then becomes a impetus for the creative activity of all of the other occasions of experience that compose the universe. And so God is among the creatures, but has a special role as the first creature, if you want, though not first temporally, but first ontologically,
Hmm.
as, yeah, the prime conditioner of creativity, the filter, you could say. And, it's important to distinguish different ways of talking about God. in the context of metaphysics, the question of belief in God, or do you believe God exists or not, is kind of irrelevant. That's not really what's at stake in metaphysics. We're trying to gain knowledge, and that's different. When it comes to religious belief, though, this question that gets debated, like, does God exist or not? Is there evidence for God, etc.? That very inquiry, that question itself, for me, is already so far downstream of the relevant inquiry that it's hard to engage with. And so, because once you ask, does God exist? Or is there evidence for believing in God? It's like you're already automatically treating God as like another thing among things in the world, that you could look around for and find.
Hmm.
And for the metaphysician, Whitehead included, but just as much
Mhm.
for Aristotle or Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas, God's more about like the condition for the possibility of there being anything at all.
Yeah,
And so it's a little bit more of an elevated, I guess, or closer to the source type of inquiry than do you believe in God or not.
sure.
So that's important to remember in any conversation about what Whitehead's trying to do with this God word.
Yeah,
But he does want to appeal, though, to our religious feelings at the end of the day, even if he brings God into his metaphysical discussion for purely logical reasons, for
hmm,
philosophical reasons, because ultimately philosophy is a human activity, and we do apparently have these religious feelings that
yeah,
search for interpretation. And he also, in addition to everything we've been talking about, which for Whitehead would be the primordial nature of God, right, as this initial condition on creativity, he also talks about the consequent nature of God, which is not God as an eternal condition, but God as a fellow sufferer who's with us, and God as the, if you want, the not only the memory of the world, but the soul of the world, and
mm,
that receptacle, to use a Platonic term from the dialogue Timaeus, wherein every single experience which has ever occurred is gathered up and collected, and not just remembered but healed in some sense and atoned. So this is Whitehead's answer to that religious longing for a sense of cosmic justice, that, like, given the wreckage of history, there is still some hope for a way in which it was all not for naught, that it was all worth something
mm,
to someone, namely to God, right? And so God can't prevent evil, but God does, in the consequent nature, somehow show how that evil, any particular evil deed, is out contextualized by the overriding beauty of the process.
mm,
And so that's Whitehead's attempt to provide a proper religious vision, right?
yeah,
That would follow from his philosophy. Though, you can read his metaphysics differently. I think there are many religious visions that, there are plenty of what, like, more pagan thinkers who draw much inspiration from Whitehead and don't want
yeah,
to talk about God as in any way, providential or whatever.
right.
But that's how Whitehead sees it. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I like your phrasing of like it out contextualizes. Um,
Mm.
yeah. Well, this was wonderful. I really appreciate it. And I hope you're doing well. And I hope teaching is going well for you. Are you working on another book project?
Sure am. Um,
Nice.
I've been revising my dissertation, and am in the final stages of that publication process. It should be out later this year, if all
Cool.
goes according to plan. It's called Crossing the Threshold, subtitled Etheric Imagination, like ether, etheric imagination in the post Kantian process philosophy of Schelling and Whitehead.
Mm,
So it really looks at the the role that imagination has played in the history of philosophy, in particular, the role that imagination plays in Kant's critiques, and the way that Kant tightens the reins a little bit too much on imagination. And
mm,
then I lean on Whitehead and Schelling to show what, when properly cultivated, imagination can grant us
true.
insight into the nature of reality in a way that Kant forbid. Though
Right.
I treat Kant as a kind of guardian of the threshold that needs to be reckoned with before one can claim, knowledge of the soul or the world or the nature of the divine and so on. So,
My God, that sounds amazing. Yeah, that's that's so interesting to think about Kant as the guardian of the threshold. I totally see that.
mm-hmm.
I have this book here, and it's
Nice.
just kind of given me,
Yeah.
it's got, you know, works from all the important German idealists. But Schelling is probably the one that hits me most.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I can't wait to read your book. That's great. Excellent.
Yeah. Well,
Cool,
thanks,
Matt.
Matthew. This has been really wonderful. I appreciate, the time you put in to do some research on my thinking and
Yeah.
ask some really great questions. I really, really enjoyed this, and yeah, appreciate
Thank
you.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, until next time, take care of yourself.
All right. Thanks. Likewise,
Peace.
Matthew.
Bye.